Welcome to episode 34 of the Pernicious Chattel channel. Today we're returning to the book The Sane Society by Erich Fromm. And this is part 3 of my series, although it is mostly understandable without watching the earlier 2 videos. Those videos do go into greater detail about human nature and the modern phenomenon of alienation. The concluding sections of the book are easier to accept once Fromm has laid down the foundations of his arguments. In today's video, we are finally going to get to the penultimate bit of the book. First of all, we're going to answer the question, is our current modern society sane? And secondly, if our society is insane, then what should we do about it? If those questions are interesting to you, then please stick around. In part 2 of this series, we did a deep dive into Fromm's diagnosis of alienation. To summarize, it is a form of being treated as a thing rather than as a person. It includes being treated as a thing by other people, treating oneself like a thing, having a lack or perceived lack or actual lack of power to influence the world, and feeling separated from the world. For Fromm, alienation is damaging to mental health. It causes people to be anxious, and it causes them to seek conformity in order to escape from that anxiety. Alienation is becoming more common and more insidious as the world develops. It's driven by modern organization of society and of capitalism. Alienation is inescapably the result of commercialization, of bureaucratization, and of consumerism. Once Fromm has fully defined all the aspects of alienation, he turns to take a closer look at the mental costs of alienation. This is outlined in the last part of Chapter 5, a subsection that he creatively labels Chapter 5.3, Alienation and Mental Health. Central to Fromm's conception of mental health is to discard mental health definitions that are subjective. That is, some psychiatrists would claim that adaptation to the modern world is mental health. But Fromm rejects this subjectivity, asserting rather that sanity should be measured against a standard of normative humanism. This idea is resting on Fromm's definition of what a human being is. That human beings are a species that drive their own evolution. It's an idea first laid out in the definition of humanity covered in part 1 of the series. Human beings are a part of nature. They're born, they die, they are made up of animal needs, and they are subject to certain animal instincts. And, as social creatures, they need to feel connected to other human beings as well as to the natural world. And that connection needs to be through love. At the same time, human beings are transcendent, and that's driven by their intelligence. They have the ability to consciously change the world, the ability to create or to destroy. They have the capacity to drive their own evolution through their individualistic, conscious intelligence. This is an intelligence that allows for an objective understanding of the world, an understanding that should be increasing in complexity as the individual, or as the species, humanity as a whole, ages. As a result, we live in constant tension between the pressing need to belong, our animal heritage, and the quintessentially human desire to be a fully conscious, intelligent human who's aware of their separateness. Quote, "To be a free man is by necessity insecure, and a thinking man by necessity uncertain." Close quote. To be human is to be anxious. To be fully developed and mature, then, is to be able to tolerate this insecurity without, quote, "panic and undue fear." Close quote. Unfortunately for the majority of people in the modern world, this maturation process and full adult humanity is undermined by alienation. In order to be fully developed, a person needs to experience his or herself as someone consciously productive and consciously creative. The mature person needs to sense themselves as being related to the world and at the same time not submerged in it. But alienation absolutely short-circuits this maturation process. Rather, alienation is to experience the world as an alien, not as a person, but as a thing that is subject to the whims of the economy, of society, and even, to a certain extent, themselves. Rather than something separate with freedom of choice and an ability to shape the world, the average modern person treats themselves as a commodity to be exchanged for money and to be used or disposed of by the buyer, whether that be our employer, our customer, or the so-called market. Ability to exercise our own independent choice is then reduced to being a consumer who can choose what to buy and consume. But even this act is alienating because we're driven by marketing and socially prescribed preferences. The modern human is trapped in this underdeveloped, immature phase. They remain victim of their anxiety, and then they seek safety in conformity. They try to be like everyone else so that they can belong and not be both powerless and alone. They remain stuck, but at least they aren't alone. Instead, they revert to being a herd animal, driven by fear into conformity and stripped of their human drive to productive, creative individuality. Unfortunately, this solution to the human condition and to the painful powerlessness of alienation ends up being a trap that leaves a person consciously or unconsciously feeling guilty, feeling insufficient, feeling inferior, and feeling depressed. Now hold on, some viewers might say. I don't feel guilty about my current situation. I didn't choose it, and I certainly am not depressed. I mean, come on, I'm anxious sometimes, and I occasionally feel weird. Maybe occasionally I feel embarrassed because I don't fit in. But that's completely normal, and most people feel like that. But Fromm is pretty definite in his diagnosis. He says to be happy, to be balanced, and mature, we have to experience a quote, intense inner activity and increasing vital energy, which occurs in productive relatedness to the world and to ourselves, close quote. This internal vital energy is utterly incompatible with the modern person, who is mostly reduced to being a consumer. After all, a consumer exists as an empty vessel. A consumer is not filled with energy and excitement and intense inner activity. A consumer is active only in the search for and acquisition of material things. A consumer exists in constant need for satisfaction, driving constant searching, constantly seeking fun and comfort, and is constantly caught in the compulsive need to avoid boredom. A consumer avoids boredom because in boredom, there is no distraction from the experience of the self as a thing. It results in being aware of the reduction of our humanity to nothing. It means feeling the lack of I as an I. To be bored is to stare into the abyss of nothingness. Depression exists because of the trap we found ourselves in. To experience individuality means not conforming, but not conforming means feeling different, anxious, and inevitably inferior. To conform means not embracing and developing individual talents, not striking out on one's own. It means not fully expressing our productive creativity. This lack leads to guilt because of lost human potential, of watching our brief and only life slipping through our fingers like so much dry sand. We're aware that we waste time, that we hide in distraction, and too often seek safe conformity. In this state, unconscious to our conscience, knowing that we're missing something but without an obvious way out, we exist in a state of bewilderment, both anxious and disappointed, both afraid and chronically unsatisfied. When we're in this state, The human being becomes vulnerable to the demagogue, naively accepting of any message of simple yet total solutions. They become easily led sheep, ready to descend into blind hatred and destruction. They can easily lose their already tenuous grip on reality, on ethics, and on decency. So we're caught in this trap, being told over and over, whether we happen to be sitting in a church pew or the football stadium seat, the elementary school desk, the couch in front of the TV, or the office chair, that we're doing everything that we should be doing to live a good life. And yet here we are, at best bewildered and compulsive, and at worst terrified and depressed. We are being stripped of our agency due to alienation. We're stripped of our ability to productively, to consciously interact with our world. We're also stripped of our ability to objectively understand that world. So we can only watch the world. We can only observe it through our senses, our eyes, our ears, touch, and so on. Our lack of agency makes our lived experience like a dream that we move through like a ghost. This experience, this complete disconnect between our humanity and our experiences, meets the criteria of insanity. We've lost our ability to objectively interact with the world. We are alienated from it. Because this loss makes us prone to anxiety and depression, then survival depends on turning down our internal voice. It depends on silencing, as best we can, our conscience. It means ignoring our human need to change, or, by not changing, to choose suffering. At the end, a human who is fully adapted to this world is, by definition, insane. He or she is out of touch with their true inner world and is incapable of objectively judging the outer world. He or she becomes effectively schizophrenic because experience doesn't match reality. A return to sanity. The majority of the book is the full elucidation of the question, is our society sane? And the short answer is, obviously, no. If a person is fully adapted to our society, then they're insane. If a person is a sane, mature human, then they have to reject many parts of our society. But Fromm keeps the remaining 20% of his book to recommend a way that we might do better. He finds sanity in a system that he calls Humanistic communitarian socialism. This system is one where human values underlie the socio-economic system. It is a system where human love for one another and for nature are supported. It requires a socialism because every person must have an inalienable right to a basic decent life, regardless of that person's ability to earn it. Fromm doesn't require complete equality, and some differences in wealth might still exist, but any of these differences would not need to be in a much narrower band than anything that currently exists. The system also requires that humans are allowed individuality and freedom. This freedom guarantees their right to participate fully in work, in society, and in politics. On this basis, he rejects all the current forms of socialism. In the case of communist Russia and China, these systems allow for the elites to rule while the average person has little or no power. This is not just about brutality and suppression of dissent in these systems, but also the bureaucracies and hierarchical power in these systems. You cannot have rigid power structures nor bureaucracy without having impersonal, alienating power. Bureaucracies operate through policy and procedure. They do not treat any person as an individual. What they seek to enforce is a level of conformity on groups. They don't see individuals as humans. Rather, they see individuals as objects. Hierarchy is simply a system that takes power from a large group and assigns that power to the top of the group. In fact, modern social democracies, even though they may be much more humane, are also similarly alienating. They're dependent on huge impersonal bureaucracies to operate, and they allocate power to a political or wealthy elite. As a result, both modern democratic socialism and communism fail to achieve a sane society. Modern unfettered capitalism is inherently alienating, not because ownership or free markets are inherently bad, but because large companies create bureaucracies and hierarchies alienating both society and workers. Unfettered capital accumulation strips the majority of individuals of power. In communitarian socialism, all workplaces would effectively be run by workers. Private ownership is possible. However, the owner cannot dictate workers' conditions. Rather, owners could function as effectively investors. They get a return on capital, but have little say over day-to-day operations. Quote, "It's a system where capital would not employ labor, but labor would employ capital." Close quote. Managerial classes would also need to be stripped of prestige and power. They would remain focused on administrative or strategic roles, but share decision-making with workers. Rather than alienating workers and managers, control would be returned to everyone involved. By necessity, this would mean a decentralization and fragmentation of our current business structures. A huge organization, a huge corporation, requires bureaucracy to function. It becomes incredibly difficult to manage through group consensus. After all, the larger the group, the greater the complexity and the slower the decision-making of that group. Similarly, modern politics, driven by large party structures who unilaterally decide on policy and limit involvement by individuals, would need to become extinct. Rather, the primary political structure would be purely local, where individuals could fully participate in making decisions that drive their life. There would then need to be a larger organization that coordinated and played a limited enforcement role, but they would have to work on the basis of decisions that originated originally at the base, smaller level communities, with that power and that decision-making being fed up to the executive. Fromm advocates for a structure where there were an elected governing body still, but that body would share power with a lower house that is literally made up of local groups. In addition, the modern nation states would need to fade dramatically in importance. Otherwise, there could be no equalizing of resources across the globe. The modern nation state stands in the way of humanity being connected in love and joined in a community. Finally, modern culture would need to change dramatically. The new system would need to allow people greater time, support, and freedom to develop themselves. Fromm has extensively criticized modern adults for being blind and immature. To counteract this situation, adult education and development has to receive the same level of support and resources as childhood education. Adult education has to be an inherent right. Constant education and constant development of greater reason is the basis of achieving adult human maturity. Humanity's potential, humanity's ability to understand the world rationally, is dependent on this process of constant development. Fromm asserts that this process is never completed either by individuals or by society as a whole. It is a constant, gradual activity that needs to be ongoing for every individual for their entire life and needs to be an ongoing project for society as a whole. We can always understand the world around us better than we currently do. We can always be more objective and reasoning, if not reasonable. It is the wellspring of our humanity and the process necessary to achieving our potential. We cannot call ourselves truly human and abandon the project of self-development. Conclusion. Fromm's final conclusion chapter is a summary of the book, but in it he presents some of his most eloquent passages. And if you'll indulge me, I'd like to share a couple. First, his simple description of the solution to our current insanity. Quote, "But we must decentralize work and the state so as to give it human proportions and permit centralization only to an optimal point where it is necessary because of the requirements of industry. In the economic sphere, we need co-management of all who work in an enterprise to permit their active and responsible participation. The new forms for such participation can be found in the political sphere, a return to town meetings by creating thousands of face-to-face groups, which are well-informed, which discuss, and whose decisions are then integrated into a new lower house. A cultural renaissance must combine work education for the young, adult education, and a new system of popular art and secular ritual throughout the whole nation." Close quote. Inherent in Fromm's message is that our current lives are dominated by systems and institutions that are too large to control or understand. Systems and institutions that we created, but that we end up enslaved to. For the fans of Ivan Illich, you'll notice that there is a very clear relationship between these thinkers. This is a point that has been brought up again and again by environmentalists, by sociologists, and in this case by a psychotherapist. We've not lost control because of our lack of creativity, rather because our human intellectual capacity, and certainly our current capacity for wisdom, is wholly insufficient for the size of our creations. We are quite literally Dr. Frankenstein staring at his monster. In the final chapter of the book, Fromm writes, quote, "Man today is confronted with the most fundamental choice. Not that between capitalism or communism, but that between robotism, of both the capitalist and the communist variety, or humanistic, communitarian socialism. Most facts seem to indicate that it is choosing robotism, and that means, in the long run, insanity and destruction. But all these facts are not strong enough to destroy faith in man's reason, goodwill, and sanity. As long as we can think of other alternatives, we are not lost. As long as we can consult together and plan together, we can hope. But indeed, the shadows are lengthening. The voices of insanity are becoming louder. We are in reach of achieving a state of humanity which corresponds to the vision of our great teachers. Yet we are in danger of the destruction of all civilization or of robotization. A small tribe was told thousands of years ago, 'I put before you life and death, blessings and curse, and you chose life. This is our choice too.'" Close quote. Here, perhaps Fromm is speaking as a prophet, calling his people back to righteousness. But I think the statement is also a rather simple one. We've brought this world into existence, therefore we can change it. Modern ears may not resonate with the idea of a choice between capitalism and communism, rather that there is a choice of a more sane and human, a more satisfying, happy life that doesn't involve accepting out-of-control capitalism as the only choice. Neither does it require accepting mass technology regardless of its cost. We can choose a different way, but that requires actively ensuring that everyone has the ability to be involved. It means choosing a complete decentralization and perhaps destruction of all existing institutions. It means allowing for active, constant criticism of everything that we've accepted as necessary and perhaps even good. Although Fromm doesn't use the C word, I think that I will. Fromm lays out a path for humanity to take, but that path isn't an easy one. It is a path that requires, more than anything else, courage. Closing. And that's it for my coverage of the book The Sane Society by Erich Fromm. But I have to say, sadly for my audience, probably not the last one in this series. This book, and I guess like most really profound books, has got me thinking a lot about my own life and about this current moment in our history. So I think this series will include one more video where I'll play with some of Fromm's ideas as interpretive tools through which to understand or interpret our current day and age. If that's something you'd enjoy watching, then please subscribe to the channel in order to be notified. Until next time, this is XCG wishing you the sanity to see clearly your path to freedom.